welcome to the Ron Johnson Discipleship Podcast.
And a big happy Thanksgiving from Pastor Andrew and myself as we launch this podcast on Thanksgiving Day. So if you're watching this, we're wishing you and your household an incredible holiday, a great time of fellowship and food as we celebrate and remember the goodness of God in our lives. And we're glad you're tuning into this podcast. We've got a lot to talk about. We've been in a book by Rod Dreher called Live Not by Lies. And last week we were talking about how basically what do we do about it. We talked about all the problems that are happening and kind of the attack on our liberties. But then we got into the transition in that book about what to do about it. Of course, last week we talked about valuing truth more than anything else and being willing to speak it.
Right.
And I've been, in the series about bringing Jesus with us to work, we've been challenging our people to view their marketplace and where they spend most of their week as a place of ministry. And of course that includes speaking the truth, telling people the good news of the gospel and how important it is that we continue to speak truth in a culture that continually tries to put us in a box.
Well, as a child, you hear the story of the Empress No Clothes On, right? You hear that it's like a bedtime story. It's kind of like,
Well, you kind of
laugh at as a kid. Just be like, okay, this king, he's in his underwear and everyone's kind of playing along. Fast forward decades later, I'm like, wow, whoever wrote that story is very profound because it takes a child, the courage, the mind of a child, to be able to call that out, the innocence of a child, the courage of a child to say, no, that's not true. Yes. And I don't know what you guys are saying, but this is truth right here. This is truth. And from that comes the courage to be passed on for other people to say, you know what? I'm with them. Yeah. That's the truth.
So just speaking the truth about gender, about marriage, about other things, it penetrates the lie. It keeps that house of cards that's being established. It crumbles to the ground when we speak.
We need
the
to
truth.
reach a threshold, right? Of at one point the lies start toppling down, and I think America might not reach it yet, but there's a lot of people speaking truth, and we need to continue to kind of build on that cascading.
Well, I'm thinking of the mama bears at the school board meetings that really got fed up with all the stuff that was being shoved down our throats regarding our kids and what's being taught, and all of a sudden, like, who do you parents think you are? I mean, what happened is we reached a critical mass where a bunch of parents were just fed up, and they said, we've had enough of this, and they showed up at school board, and they started telling the truth, and all of a sudden, again, when people do that, the whole system collapses, and you realize that you're not going to continue to act the way that you've been acting. So that's what we're saying, is we're at a point in our history where in America where we just need to speak the truth, speak it in love, but speak the truth.
Absolutely.
The second thing we're going to talk about today is cultivating a cultural memory, and I think it's interesting just providentially that this podcast is happening on Thanksgiving, because when you're talking about cultivating a cultural memory, the author points out that without a national identity, you fall apart as a people. Like there's nothing to hold you together. So, for instance, Thanksgiving, one of our American holidays. What do we do at Thanksgiving? Well, we give thanks. Well, we give thanks to who? We give thanks to God Almighty because our nation presupposes a supreme being. Every one of our founding documents, our history goes back to a belief in God. So God is part of our nation's cultural identity, and then we go back and what are we thanking him for? Well, we rehearse our history, and it's those shared moments when we come together like this, sitting around tables, eating our Thanksgiving meal, thanking God for America and for the things that make America great. This is part of our shared national history. This is important. All of our holidays, we have Memorial Day. What do we do on Memorial Day? We remember those who have paid the ultimate price and given their lives for the freedoms that we enjoy. Well, that involves a whole history lesson of the wars and different things that Americans have fought to preserve our freedom. So all of these things kind of, weave together to form a national identity that we all share as Americans. Yeah. Of course, this goes back, I think, in the Bible. God told Israel to come together, 7 different feasts throughout the year where they would come together. For instance, the Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, trumpets, atonement, Feast of Tabernacles. There were all these feasts, but they all pointed to the fulfillment that would come in Jesus Christ. But every year, everyone who was an Israelite would come together and they would celebrate, like Passover. They remembered their deliverance from Egypt. And that formed a national identity of cohesiveness that pulled them together as a people.
And if you think about the history of Israel, I mean, has any other people group being attacked, separated, oppressed, sent to corners of the world, but somehow they still maintain their identity, their culture, their heritage, that they are even surrounded by enemies, they can remain so independently and strong. How do you do that? It's because of all these traditions that God himself has instituted for them and that they follow through on. And this is the importance of tradition. You know, growing up, you know, as a young person who's kind of rebellious and disruptive, I'm like, tradition, what's the point of traditions, you know?
Right.
And now that I'm in my 40s, I realize, wow, you know, there are good traditions and bad traditions. We need to consider the root of our tradition. But before you throw away the tradition, consider why is that there in the first place? What's the purpose of that tradition? Because you might be removing a cornerstone, the foundations of something that you don't want to disrupt, right?
Yeah, no, that's good. Traditions are like the glue, you know, that holds one generation together with the next, and it gives you a sense of continuity.
Absolutely.
And so what we're seeing right now that's especially disturbing, and of course, Rod Dreher points to Soviet bloc countries, you know, Eastern European countries, post-communist countries as examples. But we're trying to say that so much of what happened there already, we see the harbingers of the same thing happening in America. In other words, we are witnessing an assault on our understanding of what it means to be an American. We're seeing an attack on our fundamental points of history. In fact, you know, without going into detail, even Thanksgiving is under assault. You know, it's viewed that we came here and we attacked all the Indians and we stole all their land and all this kind of stuff, which is a very revisionist understanding of what actually happened and not an accurate understanding at all as it relates to Thanksgiving. But all of this gets lost if we don't teach it in our schools and we don't teach it in our homes. And then what's crazy is you have a whole bunch of young people today, because our history has been poisoned, they have a disdain or a hatred for their own country.
Right.
How can a nation survive if its own citizens have a disgust or a hatred for their national identity? And of course, this is all very intentional.
Right. And this is interesting because what Rod Dreher really showed me was that you cannot establish a brand new foundation unless you take away the old foundation.
Right.
So years and years of cascade. You know, I did not learn about America's Christian heritage until I was in my post-college, in my 20s.
Yeah.
And then I was in a completely different training school. And I heard about some of the letters they wrote and how the founding fathers talk about God. I'm like, I've never heard this ever in my life. I've been through high school, university. I've never heard about any of this stuff. Right. It was amazing to me.
The miraculous interventions of God in the founding of our nation. Our nation's a miracle. And it doesn't mean that our nation's perfect, but our nation was founded by deeply Jesus-loving people. And when you take all that out and you take out the true history of America, you miss the beauty of what God is trying to do through us.
The focus is not on the perfection of man, which we're not perfect and we make tons of mistakes. The focus is on what God has done, particularly in the formation of the founding of our nation, that this is a gift and this is a blessing.
Yeah.
So again, when people talk about, the founding fathers are not perfect, that's not the point. I'm not talking about the founding fathers. I'm talking about God's intervention on their life, kind of like the Bible. We had a bunch of imperfect people in the Bible. Do we just throw Israel out? No, God has specifically selected that group of people and his mark on that.
When you look at our history, you know, this is not a nation of immigrants. In other words, the people that came here from Europe were not immigrants. The immigrants just moved from one nation to the next. These were settlers. There's a difference.
Yeah.
Settlers are looking to establish a new country, a new rule, a nation under God, a city on a hill. They use all this biblical language. They are fleeing persecution. And so, you know, a lot of times people say, well, people came here to America, they're trying to get wealthy, blah, blah, blah. There certainly were those people.
Sure.
But at the beginning of this nation, they had one thing clear in mind, and that was to establish a nation under God or a colony under God where they could live out their religious liberties and live and honor the Lord with their lives. So,
and the point you made earlier is this is all very intentional to erase those cultural memories, because when you are tethered to no culture, no tradition, no sense of national identity, then you are simply tethered to the government. tethered to whoever has a larger social media presence and voice. And that's what they're trying to do on the national level, right? And that's why it's so important. And I love what Rodriguez said. This is one way we can resist by telling the truth, is actually by adhering to traditions and values and families and gather small group religious gathering, community gathering, which I was like, this is brilliant. You know?
Well, I came from an event earlier, a TPUSA faith event, and two amazing historians were there. One was David Barton. We've done a lot of David Barton's material here, just incredible recoverer of America's true history. And then William Federer, who's written extensively about America's and world history. Both of those folks I would love to get at Living Stones in the near future, just because I feel like we almost need to recover these amazing truths about who we were, or lest we lose our identity. And I'll give you an example from the book. He talks about a 26-year-old California woman who was just fawning over the beauty of communism. It's equity, and everybody having a chicken in their pot, and everybody living in the same size house, and everybody under their own shade tree in the backyard. And what a beautiful world. And again, that kind of utopianistic notion is easy to fall in love with until you realize it's never, ever, ever, ever taken place in history. In fact, just the opposite. And so as he's talking to her, she's talking to him about, hey, well, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm researching the horrors of Stalin's, gulags, and the absolute bloodshed that has happened over, especially in the 20th century. I forget how many hundreds of millions of people were murdered under communistic regimes. I mean, it was a bloodbath. But here's a person who's come through the American system, has no understanding of our history, and she sat under Marxist university teachers that have given her this idealistic, view of what communism is. She's completely oblivious to the absolute horror that is the true fruit of communism.
It's crazy how in a few generations, but it's really not crazy because the Israelites forget. That's why God kept saying build monuments, because Israelites in one generation forget about their faithfulness. They start building the pole, Asherah poles, and the temple to Baal or whatever. So we have very short memories. But you and I were just talking about when I was in Cambodia a couple of years ago. And for those who don't know Cambodia's history, I mean, they just a few decades ago went through a horrible genocide. The Khmer Rouge, I think, came in and just Pol Pot destroyed their people. And we were able to go to like a local high school who ended up being a torture camp for the prisoners.
So imagine going to your local high school, this beautiful building. It was a nice brick building. You can tell it was a school, smaller classrooms, etc. But you walk through there, and that entire facility was dedicated to just simply torturing people who would have been viewed as threats to the communist regime. And it made no sense.
The way it probably was the most horrific thing I've ever seen. It was a museum now, and I was just going through this. I'm like, what is the purpose of this museum? Is this to traumatize us, to tell us to celebrate how horrible this was? And as I'm experiencing this, I mean, even now I'm thinking it's some of the images I don't ever want to see again, right? And as I'm coming out, struggling, listening to the headphones, that kind of English tells you what happened as you go to a different station. At the very end, there was a huge monument, and in English it says, "So we will not forget what happened." And in that moment, I realized why all of this is happening. They're not doing this to celebrate the horror. They were doing this because they're saying human beings could do this again, and we have to remember so this will never ever happen again in our land or anywhere else.
But I think the reason, because you walk through there and you're going, why? This is just an absolute senseless destruction of their culture, of their leaders, of the educated folks, of the professional class. I mean, it was just a massive slaughter of just their own common people. The same thing has happened in every communist country, and I think that's what Dreher's trying to point out. What is the reason behind it? I mean, the communists do this for a reason. They have to destroy the past if they want to create a new revolutionary future. And so the past usually involves Christianity, usually involves traditional marriage and family. It obviously involves an attack on the church, because these are the transmitters of cultural identity throughout cultures.
Yeah.
And if you don't destroy the history and the truth about who you were, you can never brainwash people into this great new future.
So that monument itself was a resistance to totalitarianism.
Yeah.
But you think about all the, even just in the last couple of years, all the statues and all the memorials that's been taken down and tarnished, and all the history that's been erased, or traditional family being attacked, and you're just like, this is all, there is a strategic plan behind all this.
Yeah, it's a revolutionary tactic. The problem is revolutionaries aren't really good at building things. They're great at destroying things, but they're not really good at building things. You know, you talked about Cambodia. I had the pleasure as well of being in Israel and going through the Holocaust Museum there. I mean, you talk about a sobering.
Wow.
Oh, I mean, it very similar feeling as you're walking through these places, and first of all, you're going, how could human beings perpetrate such wickedness and evil against each other? And then secondly, you look at the intentionality behind an ideology that says we have to exterminate the entire Jewish race, or we have to exterminate, whatever the previous regime was. Or, we talked about historically, like Hitler, he changed all the German holidays. So, and we're seeing this in America. So instead of Christmas break or Thanksgiving break, we now call it winter solstice or winter break. It's very pagan. It is it's tied to the worship of Earth and the seasons and Mother Earth and all this kind of stuff. It's an attack on our Christian foundations, and it's an attack on our identity. And this has happened all throughout history. You go back even the French Revolution. I was amazed. All the places of worship were turned into temples of reason, worshiping reason, human understanding, godless places, and of course that led to the guillotine and the massive bloodshed that happened in the French Revolution. So the point is, I mean, literally, you can go through all of history, and anybody with a brain, in one half of a brain cell, could look at history and go, why would we even entertain Marxist ideology? Everywhere that it has been introduced, it has led to the slaughter of millions and millions of people. And yet that's exactly what we're facing in America today. In fact, I thought this was interesting. He talks about victims of communism, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. This is an annual survey of Americans to determine their attitudes on communism, socialism, and Marxism. And they quote the 2019 results, that more Americans have a favorable view of left-wing radicalism than ever in the history of America. In fact, he said 57% of millennials believe the Declaration of Independence offers a better guarantee of freedom and equality than the Communist Manifesto. In other words, there's 40% of Americans who actually have a more favorable view, at least of millennials, of the Communist Manifesto than the Declaration of Independence. How disgusting is that? Even, I thank God it's not 60-40, but how can 40% of millennials have a positive view of the Communist Manifesto? But that's where we're at today. And so we see this hateful ideology that's romanticized by ignorant young people. And I want to say this, our universities are largely the problem here, because this is where our young people are being poisoned about our past and poisoned about the glories of Marxism, and our Christian roots are being attacked, our foundational documents are being attacked. And, he brings out the point. He says, while there's nobody, most young people today, when they understand what happened in the Soviet Gulag, will not celebrate that and say, oh, that was great. But they're not connecting the dots. They're continuing to believe in the same myths that led to the gulags in the first place. And so we're not at a good place, because when we have folks that cannot connect the dots between certain beliefs or worldviews and the outcomes of those worldviews.
No one will celebrate the Gulag. No one will openly, in culture and media, celebrate the Nazis. However, the same ideology that leads to those things, the destroying of history, it's being celebrated, implemented. It's a bait and switch, right?
Yep.
Like, this is not going to lead to that. Well, it's the same ideology that goes down that path. So.
And if you've ever been introduced to the book 1984, right, which that was actually when I graduated from college, so that's not too futuristic for me, but it was a futuristic novel, and basically in that novel, The Ministry of Information was tasked with erasing all newspaper records of past events to reflect the current political priorities of the party. This is the goal of totalitarianism. So you go back and you rewrite history, and you put it all through the lens of whatever the current orthodoxy is. So right now there's a big move, and there has been for decades, to remove all the Western Civ classes from our universities. Well, what is Western Civ? It's all the ideas that led to American greatness. It was Christianity. It was the rule of law. It was things like hard work, work ethic, rule of law, equality under the law, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, all the things that led to like the American creed, who we are as Americans. Yeah. Now this is all viewed through racial lens, LGBTQ lenses. Basically, any oppressed minority, at least that's what they call them, that was overlooked somehow. Their voices were not heard. Now we have to go back and we have to have, lesbian history, feminist history, black history, Latin history. I mean, everybody's got their own version. And so what you have is this shotgun approach with no one singular identity.
Yeah, it's a competition who can be the greatest victims.
Yeah, that's right. And so you have to completely deconstruct everything, and now you're not even allowed to bring up some of these foundations again of Western Civ.
Yeah, and I was sharing this with Pastor earlier. It's like in America, the history of America, we've been very blessed, in which communism, Marxism has not exactly. We have not faced that in a very tangible way on our shores.
Right.
But all over the world, there's some great, huge impacts all around. And what happens is a lot of immigrants to the United States are very, very more keenly aware of this danger because they felt it 1 or 2 generations ago.
They've got grandparents that lived through it. We've got people at our own church whose parents immigrated here and fled, countries where there was threats, to their life and their freedoms.
My parents and in-laws went through the Civil War in China.
Yep.
And they faced those things.
Yep.
And I felt the impact of those trauma and terrors, but indirectly, until one day I saw a movie. Again, this is my 20s, called To Live, made by it's a Chinese movie, which I think. Back then it was. I'm sure it's still banned in China right now.
Oh yeah.
It's very well acted. Famous director. I forgot the director's name. Famous actors and actress in it, and it really shows what life was like during the Cultural Revolution. Now, I never really understood the Cultural Revolution. I didn't understand. I just knew that they wanted to erase all vestige of culture.
Yep.
They burned stuff. If you wore glasses, they sent you to jail because you're supposed to be a scholar, and they want to remove all of that. They remove all the older scholars. They put all the newer people in place, all the old veterans.
Because that's all the history. That's history embodied right there.
And millions of people died throughout that whole situation. And they just talk about the story of a family who went through that. And when I saw that movie, it was a horrific experience. I don't ever want to watch it again. Not because it was a bad movie, it's because it elicits some deep things in our hearts.
It awakened something in you. You now understand, like, you're not in this slumber. You understand there's real evil.
He connected me to my heritage and to why my parents and my grandparents and this threat of cultural revolution, cultural erasing of this conformity, totalitarianism for once became very real in my life.
Yep.
And what I believe is every American, every young person needs to have one of those moments. Now, you might not have a Chinese heritage like I'd have, but to watch some of these movies yourself and feel the terror and feel the horrors of what it look like when neighbors are reporting on neighbors. And then family turning on each other because of the horrors of the government overreaching. And then you're just like, oh, censorship. Wow, that's what censorship could lead into.
I was at a conference and one of the speakers just mentioned in passing a book that had powerfully impacted her life. It's called The Happiest Man on Earth. It's about a man who survived Auschwitz. And I listened to it on Audible, and I was so wrecked by that. I told all my kids, I said, every one of you should listen to this book. Well, my daughter took me up on it, my daughter Lauren, and she called me up. She'd go for a walk every morning and listen to it, and she called me up with tears. It was just so profoundly moved by what this man had experienced under the Nazis. And again, we're asking, like, how does this happen? You know, one of the strategies when you get in and you look at these takeovers is the first thing they do is they take over all the media, and then they take over higher education. So you're not even allowed to go to a university if you believe in Christ, or you believe in the family, or you love your country, or those types of things. You're not even allowed to go to the university because it's a stranglehold on information. All you hear is misinformation.
Yep.
All you hear are the lies of the current orthodoxy. And this is what we're witnessing now in America today. We have a stranglehold of the media. That's why when Trump came out and said fake news, every normal person said, yes, that's exactly what it is, because we've listened to just a one-sided view of the news, very anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-biblical worldview espoused across the board on the media. In our universities, it is hard to find someone that is a conservative or an outspoken Christian who's teaching in the faculty. It has been completely hijacked by leftists. This is our state universities. So when all you're getting in our universities and all you're hearing on the media is one side, one ideology, it brainwashes an entire generation. And then you have public education, and that's why public education is such a battlefield, because we understand that what's taught in the classrooms now will be in the government in 20 or 30 years. Yeah. And so what is being taught? What view of America? What understanding of history? What history of any accurate history is being taught? And so this is what happens in totalitarian countries, and we need to see that it's happening in our own country right now.
And I love his remedy is the local community, the family, the dinner table, the local churches.
I like this. He
religious centers,
small fortresses of memory.
Yeah.
So if you're not allowed to speak publicly about your views, your values about Christ, or about exposing the truth about the communist revolution, because if you did that, your kids would be taken from you and you'd end up in jail. So you create these little fortresses. Talk about that. What does it mean?
Yeah, so it's basically even the words, he's talking about how the words have been distorted. So the words like tolerance and love have their own meanings. And even when you argue with people, debate people, it's so confusing because you have different frameworks.
Say the same word, but completely different meaning.
That's why in these little fortresses, these little platoons, we're able to talk normal and actually be on the same page and communicate ideas, and we're not worried about trying to fend off attacks. We can just be ourselves,
right. I didn't realize this, the hatred that the Marxists have for the family, because the family is the vehicle by which values are transmitted, but also wealth is transmitted. It's for personal property. It goes from one generation to the next. Well, communists hate that. So they're always trying to destroy the traditional nuclear family. So they separate your kids from you when you're young. They want you to go off to somewhere else to learn. Many times they're teaching you values that are completely against the values of Christ. It was interesting, too, what the Soviets promised was that you would have, they're promising young people sexual freedom and sexual liberation. Well, what kid when he's 16 and his hormones are going crazy doesn't want to be able to express himself sexually? So you attack the church, you attack God. You
anything
attack
that holds back that restraint,
any restraint.
Birth control, any type of,
Yeah. And of course, when you're older, you realize, there's wisdom there. It makes sense why God told us to keep our sexuality within certain boundaries so that we don't destroy ourselves and other people.
Right.
But again, you just fuel all these passions. The goal is to create a wedge between students and their parents. Well, we're seeing that again across America today. That is, we're setting up Planned Parenthood, birth control, and abortion clinics in urban areas where kids can have an abortion without their parents even knowing, where kids can go through gender transition without their parents even knowing. I mean, it is an open assault on parental values, and you need to understand that the reason behind it is there's a revolution that some would like to take place in America.
Right.
That would completely destroy everything America has stood for.
And even this understanding of traditions and culture and how that's an insulation against socialism and radical leftism, it makes a lot of sense. If you look at all the urban centers in America versus the rural or the smaller countryside or even the suburbs, you see that all the urban centers are deep blue, And I always wonder why. What is it about? I mean, I think there's a big spiritual element to it, which I'm not gonna get too much there. But I think I'm not gonna. I think that's the main element. But I think also it's because in the urban area. I mean, yeah, you got the sports teams that kind of ties the city together. But outside of that, people are so disconnected. Yeah. They're so close together. Right. But just the lifestyle, the institutions, how things are. There's less. People don't know each other. Whereas, in the suburbs or in the smaller towns like where we live, there is a sense of like, I'm from the region, I'm from this area, I was born in this area. There's a cultural tie that kind of, or community tie that kind of lends you into the sense of like community. So in a very subtle way, these community ties actually helps you trend to be more conservative and think about family and care about family more.
You feel connected, you're more mentally healthy, you're relationally connected. Which again, think about this. We have an administration and a party in America that is committed to open borders, which means anybody can come and go into our country as they please, which means there's no assimilation, there's no cultural identity that must be established. So we actually are inviting people into our country now that hate our country. Which again is suicide from a national level. There used to be a process of assimilation, and certain groups of people were not allowed to become Americans, not because of some bias, but because they didn't share our values. Right. Like, why would you let somebody in your country whose outspoken goal is to destroy your country? They think you're evil, and they want to destroy you. No sane nation would say, "Oh yeah, come on into our country."
You wouldn't do it for your company. You wouldn't do it for your church. You wouldn't do it for your family.
So if you have an open border with no assimilation process, no rule of law, that is an overt attack on America, is what it is. It's an overt attack because you're just simply saying no borders, no identity, no unity, and you're signing your own suicide as a nation. And people get that. They absolutely get this. They want to see America destroyed, and they want to see a new America take its place. And to do that, they have to destroy all these things we're talking about. So we see a massive attack on the family. The other thing that we're seeing an attack on is the church and biblical values and preaching the truth from the pulpit. That's why so many churches were considered non-essential during the COVID outbreak, right? Because there's zero respect. And they also understand that that's where people are going to go to find unity and hope and to find transcendence, which again, in modern American culture, there is no embracing of any kind of transcendent values that hold us together.
Well, now the crazy lockdowns makes a lot more sense because if you're trying to instigate isolation, you want to keep people separate, physically, emotionally separate from each other,
bankrupt
mental health issues,
bankrupt businesses.
I mean, there's so many layers to all of this that once you start studying this, you realize, man, they know the scheme, they know the plan.
Now, people listening to this would say, "Oh, there they go on those conspiracy theories." Well, it shows your ignorance, not our ignorance, because this is exactly what Marxism tries to do. It's the playbook. This is not conspiracy. This is actual playbook. And if you can't see neo-Marxism all around in America today, in our universities, in the critical race theory, the ideology behind the BLM movement, which has kind of disappeared once it was exposed, the ideology. This is not conspiracy. This is reality. This is history.
I just challenge any of you to go watch that movie To Live. Go watch it. Go watch it for yourself. Spend 2 hours watching the horrors of what happened during the Cultural Revolution from a normal person's perspective. Read some of these books. What was that book that you talked about that you had Lauren read?
Oh, it's called The Happiest Man on Earth or Happiest Man Alive, something like that. It is a powerful
read some of these books, read some of these stories, read about the development, because what makes us better than them?
Yeah, and you don't have to go to Israel to experience the horrors of what the Nazis did to the Jews. You can go to Washington, D.C. There's a museum there.
There's a Holocaust museum there.
Yes, and educate yourselves on these things and wake up because it can happen to us if we allow our children to be cut off from our beautiful, godly American heritage. And again, we're not saying cover the warts. Everybody's a fallen human being, and we have our own warts. But by and large, what you'll see is a picture of of an America that has been incredibly blessed by the Lord, that's founded by people that believed in the Word of God, strong families, strong marriages, strong work ethic, greatest nation that the world has ever seen. We have so much to be thankful for. Let's talk about one more thing before we close here, just to wrap it up here. He also mentioned the importance of a parallel polis, which is just simply the word for city or government, into sanctuary cities. In other words, what we're seeing is as there's a suppression or an attack in the larger culture on our faith, on our values, on education, you're seeing people create parallel businesses, parallel schools. You know, we have two schools that meet in our building here, our Livingstone's homeschool educators, and also a classical Christian education homeschool group. They continued to meet during COVID. Mm-hmm. They had no restrictions because we placed no restrictions on them. Yeah. We have a lot of people that are homeschooling. Well, when you're raising your kids at home, you don't have to report to anybody else. Yep. And you can teach whatever you want to teach, and you can educate your kids with your values. These are all examples of parallel things. You know, we got a lot of people that say, look, all right, if you're not going to let me express my views here at work, I'm going to create my own private business where I got no one to report to but myself. In other words, you take things into your own hands and you begin to create.
Parallel social media outlet,
we saw
business outlet, True Social and Rumble, all these different things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you know, we saw this heavy-handed muzzling of people's viewpoints on Twitter. So I love it. So what happens? A private businessman buys Twitter, and now he says, okay, we're taking all those restraints off and we're reinstating people. You know, I love it because that's just the free market working. There are people trying to destroy the free market, trying to minimize the choices that we have economically and in every other way. Of course, bigger the government gets, less freedom we have as individuals. So all of this stuff is an orchestrated attack. Of course, we know that there's a demonic attack behind it, but an orchestrated attack to rewrite American history and to remake America into a radicalized, different America as we move forward. And if you understand it and see it and you understand the importance of tradition and values, you'll understand why your kitchen table is so important.
Yep.
And you'll understand why Sunday worship is so important. These are two gathering places where Christian values and where family traditions and where a collective cultural identity and history are transmitted from one generation to the next.
So what could you do this holiday as a resistance to this attack of, I wouldn't say inevitable. I mean, some of these guys are kind of doom and gloom. I'm like, no, I think we're far from lost, especially as we keep reading and getting this word out.
We're not victims.
No, is have great time with your family during Thanksgiving. Establish tradition with your family. Do something. Explain to your kids why do you have these traditions. Tell them deeply. We don't just do things for the sake of doing them because they reflect something. They reflect the glory of God. They reflect that we love for each other.
Intentionally thank the Lord. Honor Him. Rehearse His history in your personal family's life.
Absolutely.
I mean, we all have so much to be grateful.
Remember your heritage. Remember where you come from. Remember what God has done in your life, how God has blessed you.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting because slowly I'm starting to tell my kids some of my history and how what God's taken me and my wife through. As they get older, I'm starting to tell them those stories. And in fact, some of these stories I tell them become landmarks in their lives, in their struggles. And I'm just, I'm not that old, and those stories are really impacting my young kids so much. I'm just thinking, wow, this is what God wants to remember, because these historical story of your nationality where God comes through, how important that is for the future generation to remember. That's the God that parted the Red Sea for us.
Absolutely.
And if He can part the Red Sea for us, He can do this for me now.
And in a lot of these communistic movements, they were amazed at how resistant people were to their ideology because of the tight family bonds and the tight bonds they had with Christ and with their worshiping community of faith.
Yeah.
And that's why they had to go after those groups, because your family and your church are your two biggest obstacles.
Absolutely.
And so keep that in mind as we're moving forward. And when you see attacks in through public education on parental rights and these types of things, you should wake up. When you see attacks on the church and religious liberty, or people saying, well, you shouldn't have the right to say that, you should wake up, because these are overt attacks on the two institutions that are absolutely critical if we're going to retain our cultural identity.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much. I'm not assuming that a whole bunch of you are actually watching us on Thanksgiving. I hope you have better things to do, like eating turkey and doing the things we just talked about. But I hope as you're circling around that this has been very helpful to you. And as always, it is a privilege to share some time with you. We love your feedback, so continue to weigh in on this and help us as we cast a vision for where this podcast goes in the future. So, hey, happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Matthew, happy Thanksgiving. And you guys, happy Thanksgiving. We love you.